On August 3, 2017, a submarine went missing off the coast of Copenhagen in Denmark. Just like in many missing persons cases, the world was glued to the updates, waiting, hoping, and watching. And maybe it's because when someone disappears, time becomes our greatest enemy. In those situations, every minute matters, especially with submarines, where the oxygen is limited and the countdown begins the moment you go underwater. There's something deeply terrifying about being trapped beneath the ocean. The silence feels heavy, the darkness is endless, and the isolation is almost unnatural. People who've been inside submarines say it's like slipping into another world, one that doesn't care if you scream. As the vessel sinks deeper, the sounds of the world above fade away completely. The surface becomes a distant memory. No light, no sound, just pressure closing in. You're not just far from home, you're cut off from everything that feels safe. Some say it's like being in space, but colder and more haunting. Maybe that's why submarine tragedies haunt us so much. The thought of being trapped in the deep, with no way out and no one around, taps into a fear that feels almost primal. It's not just about drowning, it's about vanishing into silence, completely alone, where no one can hear you. But what made this 2017 case even more gripping was that it didn't just involve a missing submarine, it was a homemade one. And only 2 people were on board, and they were practically strangers. One of them was Peter Madsen, the man who built the submarine himself. In Denmark, he was somewhat of a local celebrity. People saw him as this eccentric genius who was always chasing bold, outlandish dreams. He was known for his wild inventions, rockets, and submarines. This was actually his 3rd submarine. The other person on board was 30-year-old Kim Wall, a renowned journalist who had joined Peter on his submarine for an interview she was writing for Wired magazine. Kim wasn't just any journalist, she was absolutely exceptional. She had reported for The Guardian, The New York Times, Harper's Magazine, Vice, Slate, Foreign Policy, and more. She reported from every corner of the world, the post-war Sri Lanka, disaster-stricken Haiti, the aftermath of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, and even the tightly controlled borders of North Korea. Her reporting gave a voice to those often unheard. Her resume was incredible, and she had done it all before turning 30. But tragically, Kim Wall would never return from that submarine trip. Only Peter Madsen came back to the shore, alone. What was supposed to be a simple interview beneath the waves turned into something darker. Kim had vanished, with no trace. As the investigation unfolded, the truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Kim had been murdered, her body dismembered, and when police dug deeper, what they found chilled them to the bone. On Peter Madsen's computer were disturbing snuff films, showing women being tortured, beheaded, and even set on fire. And it wasn't what he had just come across, it was what he had searched for and downloaded. Just hours before Kim stepped onto his submarine, he had typed into his search bar, "Girl decapitated agony." This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was something he had fantasized about. It was cold, calculated, and cruel. The submarine hadn't just been a vessel, it had been his trap. Welcome to Slice of Darkness. This is your host, Alyssa. This case has been the focus of 2 major documentaries, Undercurrent on HBO and Into the Deep on Netflix. Both take very different approaches, and depending on what you're looking for, you might prefer one over the other. Undercurrent gives a deeply insightful look at Kim Wall's life. It was made with the involvement of her family and friends, and it really highlights who she was as a journalist and as a person. You walk away feeling like you knew her. Into the Deep, on the other hand, is a much darker watch. It focuses heavily on Peter Madsen and the disturbing footage filmed in the months leading up to the murder. The filmmaker had originally set out to make a science documentary about him as this eccentric genius. What she ended up capturing was something far more chilling, a wolf hiding in sheep's clothing. So if you're drawn to criminal psychology and want to see how evil can hide in plain sight, Into the Deep explores that unsettling angle. Both are haunting in their own ways. If you want to learn more or support Kim's legacy, I'll include a link to the Kim Wall Foundation, an initiative that empowers young female journalists. Kim Wall was born and raised in Sweden near the Denmark-Sweden border. Both of her parents were journalists, so she spent much of her childhood in newsrooms watching, listening, and absorbing. That experience shaped her deeply. From a young age, she knew she wanted to understand the world and help others do the same. She once said her goal was to see how the world works and maybe one day make a difference. And she absolutely did. Kim wasn't just accomplished, she was absolutely extraordinary. She had 2 master's degrees, one from the Columbia School of Journalism, and she had studied Mandarin, attending university in both London and Beijing. She was a United Nations Press Fellow and was truly unstoppable. She took on the stories most people avoided, reporting from dangerous or overlooked places, but she was never reckless. She even took hostile environment training to prepare for worst-case scenarios like kidnappings or car accidents. By the summer of 2017, Kim was living in Copenhagen with her boyfriend. They were both doing well in their careers and had just received an exciting opportunity to move to China for work. Everything was falling into place. Her friends planned a farewell party to celebrate this new chapter, but Kim, ever the workaholic, wanted to squeeze in one last story before leaving. There was this man in Denmark that pretty much everyone knew. He was often called the Elon Musk of Denmark, which, that feels like a stretch. I guess it depends on whether you consider being compared to Elon Musk a compliment or an insult. But I have to say, financially and in terms of scale, it really doesn't add up. His name was Peter Madsen, and people called him eccentric. Some thought he was a genius inventor, but the truth is, he didn't actually invent anything. He built submarines and rockets, sure, but those already exist. He was more of a passionate builder than a true inventor, and he did it all on a small scale. His dream was to put Denmark on the map for space innovation. He believed civilians should be able to build rockets, even become astronauts. Everything he knew about rockets was self-taught, and he gave an actual TED Talk about dreaming big and breaking limits. That whole quirky genius, with a cause image, it caught the attention of Wired magazine. They reached out to Kim Wall and were like, hey, go interview this guy. Let's figure out what his deal is. For Kim, who usually covered deeply intense stories from places like North Korea, this felt like a much lighter assignment, maybe even refreshing. She arranged to meet Madsen at his workshop on August 10th for a quick sit-down interview. Later that evening, she had a going-away party planned. She and her boyfriend were about to move to China. But Madsen suggested she hop aboard his private submarine instead. He told her the waters were calm and it would just take a couple of hours. She'd already interviewed him by then, and while he was a bit quirky, he came off as passionate and harmless. So Kim ran home, told her boyfriend she was going on the submarine, and figured she could wrap up the article before the big move. There's even a video of them departing the harbor. Kim is seen waving and smiling, looking excited. The submarine was called UC-3 Nautilus, and was this giant black tube with a little tower on top. It could technically fit about 8 people, though most of the space was taken up by equipment. It was massive, and the people watching from the harbor must have been amazed. For Kim, it didn't seem like a risky move. He didn't give off any obvious red flags. It felt like just another quirky interview. This wasn't some impressive, risky expedition into the unknown. No, this was a much smaller, safer trip, maybe just 20 feet underwater. The risk was incredibly low. Everyone knew where she was and who she was with. The man she was accompanying wasn't a random stranger either. He was somewhat of a minor celebrity in Denmark. Practically everyone in Denmark, and even in Scandinavia, knew who he was. As always, she took her precautions. She even texted her boyfriend before the dive. In hindsight, the messages she sent would deeply unsettle people. One of them read, "I'm still alive, by the way, but I'm going down now. Love you." That one sentence, "I'm still alive," would come back to haunt many. The entire submarine trip and interview were only supposed to take a few hours at most. But when 10 p.m. rolled around and she hadn't returned home, her boyfriend grew worried. She hadn't even texted. Still, like anyone would, he probably tried to calm himself with logical explanations. Maybe something came up. Maybe they lost track of time. But when it was 2:30 in the morning and she was still missing, he knew something was wrong. At 3:30 a.m., he called the Coast Guard. A massive search effort began. 2 rescue helicopters, 3 ships, and even the Navy joined in to find the now missing Nautilus. Naturally, everyone was asking, how do you lose a giant submarine? How much oxygen do they have? Who else was on board? We already know a little about Kim, so let's talk about Peter now. Peter referred to himself as the creator of extreme machines. He gave TED Talks where he said wild, eccentric things like, what if you got the idea to leave Earth? And what if you wanted to go to space? He'd rant about how people at 25 already worry about retirement and prepay their funerals, living in fear of the end instead of enjoying the time they have left. His message was clear: live fully, chase your dreams, tell stories, enjoy with others, and make the most of this beautiful world. And at the time, people loved it. A biographer named Thomas followed him for a while and wrote a book about him. This was all before the murder, of course. According to Thomas, Peter had this electric charisma. He inspired people. His energy wasn't just about him. It was infectious. His message? You don't need government funding to launch rockets. You don't need permission to dream big. Peter's own backstory became part of his brand. He grew up in a tough home. His parents, Carl and Annie, had a huge age gap. Annie was 36 years younger than Carl. His father was incredibly abusive. Carl, who had lived through Nazi Germany, believed that the only way to communicate with his children was through violence. Beat them to teach, beat them to punish. It was the only parenting method he knew. Peter described his childhood as growing up under a concentration camp commander. After his parents divorced, Peter was sent to live with his dad full-time, and it was seriously rough. His dad completely forbade him from talking to his mom. From what it seems, his mom was the nicer parent. But maybe Peter felt like she failed him by not protecting him from the abuse. That's something I've noticed a lot with the criminal psychology aspect. The dad is usually the one being abusive, and the mom, who's also a victim, isn't able to step in and stop it. And instead of directing their anger at the dad, they end up hating the mom. That seems to be exactly what happened with Peter. He clearly hated his dad, but there's still this weird layer of respect or fear when he talks about him, like, yeah, he was awful, but we're just different people. But when it comes to his mom, there's zero respect. He once said, I didn't really want to live with her anyway. She was as stupid as a cat. She didn't know anything. And if that doesn't scream deep-rooted hatred for women, I don't know what does. That bitterness and resentment seemed to fuel him, but instead of dealing with it emotionally, Peter channeled it into his obsessions. First, it was rockets. From a young age, he was fixated on them. It became his life's work, building, launching, and chasing the dream of becoming a self-made space pioneer. In 2011, he got married. It was an open marriage, which seemed to align with his unconventional lifestyle. But even in his personal life, there was always this emotional distance. Like everything about him, it was calculated, detached, driven more by ego than connection. He did study a bit of engineering here and there, but most of it, totally self-taught. He even described himself as a maker of extreme machines. He said something like, I was kind of educated as an engineer, kind of as a marine engineer. And then he'd say things like, on test days, I'll just sit on a rock and cry because it's so hard to organize people and make everything work. It clearly got overwhelming. There's a ton that goes into this kind of stuff, and he admitted how lonely it could feel, but he relied heavily on people buying into his vision. He'd crowdfund these big projects, and surprisingly, it worked. Not just random people, even some wealthy backers believed in him. At this point, he had already built 3 submarines. The first one, Freya, was about 20 feet long and could fit 2 people. Then came Kraka, which had this old-school vibe and fit 3 people. And finally, the one everyone knows, Nautilus, the missing submarine. That one could hold 8 people and was made using parts you could buy at a warehouse, nothing super fancy. So once the 3 subs were done, reporters started asking, what now, Madsen? Gonna build an even bigger sub? And this is where his personality really comes through. Peter Madsen needed to be the main character. That's just who he was. He wouldn't answer like a typical engineer or CEO. He'd stare off into space dramatically and say things like, I think I'm going to do something else now. I'm going to look up at the stars. Total movie script energy. And that's exactly what he did. He pivoted to rockets. Every time he was interviewed about his projects, he'd talk in this overly poetic, cinematic way, like he was delivering a monologue he'd rehearsed. It wasn't natural. It felt like he was performing for an imaginary audience, waiting for that perfect quote moment you'd slap on a black and white poster. In 2008, he co-founded a rocket company called Copenhagen Suborbitals. He claimed he wanted to go to space. No astronaut training, of course, just vibes. One of the first things they made was a DIY centrifuge. Picture a stick, laid sideways. One end had a seat for him, the other end had fire bursting out. It would just spin him around like crazy. And he called that space training. He refused government funding. He wanted to build rockets using stuff anyone could buy locally, and honestly, it was kind of working. He poured all his own money into it, TED Talk money, crowdfunded money, everything. He even lived part-time in one of his submarines while running this rocket operation. And as for his team, most of them were unpaid volunteers or interns. A lot of young people who were super smart but maybe didn't have the degrees or the resources to get into formal aerospace jobs. But they knew their stuff. They loved rockets. And Madsen gave them a chance to actually work on that dream, which, let's be real, is incredibly rare. I mean, how many people can casually say, yeah, I worked on a rocket? This group had such a unique energy. It felt like the start of Denmark's own little space age. There was excitement, momentum, and everyone wanted to be a part of something groundbreaking. A biographer even started following Madsen to write his life story. A filmmaker began documenting him too, calling him Rocket Madsen. That footage? It later became a big part of his trial, and the Netflix true crime documentary Into the Deep. But something about the whole scene was off. Not outright alarming, just strange. The vibe at the rocket company was electric and intense. Everyone was deeply driven. Most people in the space community were driven by the passion to prove they could do it. That was their fuel. But Madsen? He had a different kind of passion. He loved being the one calling the shots. Now, he wasn't necessarily loud about it. It was more about control. He liked being in charge, liked things running his way. And the thing is, because he was so charismatic and had this huge, larger-than-life personality and people didn't question him much, whenever he did something weird or questionable, it was brushed off as, oh, that's just Peter being Peter. Still, people were drawn in. He was selling this big, bold dream, and a lot of folks bought into it. But the Royal Danish Navy? Yeah, they weren't fans. They'd known about the Nautilus way back when it was first being built. And they actually approached him and said, hey, you're building this thing in Danish waters. If anything happens, we'll be the ones searching for you. Mind sharing the plans? Legally, they couldn't stop him, but they figured maybe they could help or at least understand what they were dealing with. Once they saw the plans, though, they were quietly alarmed. The sub looked too heavy, badly designed. They didn't say it out loud, but most of them thought, this thing's going to sink one day. So when the submarine went missing in August 2017, they weren't exactly shocked. Concerned, of course, but not surprised. So they gathered their teams and launched a search. Now remember, Kim Wall's boyfriend was the one who reported them missing. That call came in around 2:30 in the early morning hours of August 11th, 2017. And about 8 hours into the search, just as the sun started rising, someone at a nearby lighthouse in Køge Bay, which is at the south of Copenhagen, spotted the submarine. There it was, just floating, bobbing peacefully in the water like nothing was wrong. And standing up in the tower of the submarine? Peter Madsen. He made radio contact with the Navy and casually told them, hey, everything's fine. Just had a few technical problems, that's why we went off the radar. And for a second, the Navy breathed a sigh of relief. But also, wow, this guy, calm as ever. Just standing there, no sign of panic. Once they got word that Madsen was safe, a lot of the commanders were reassigned. They were told to wrap it up, move on to other tasks. So they started packing up, getting ready to head out, and then, bam, they got hit with a flood of urgent calls and radio messages saying that the sub was sinking. Just seconds ago, literally seconds, it was floating. Madsen was upright, calm, talking on the radio like it was just another day on the water. There was no panic in his voice. No urgency, no hey, it's going down, I need help, nothing. He didn't even say he was about to abandon ship. But then, in the span of maybe 1 or 2 minutes, the submarine started going under. Madsen jumped into the water. He was picked up by a fisherman and taken back to harbor, where journalists were already waiting. This was quickly becoming a hot story. Reporters were shouting questions, asking if he was okay. And Peter, he's just smiling and giving thumbs up. But the Navy? They're watching this all unfold, and something felt off. They're saying submarines don't sink like that, not when they're on the surface, not when they were functioning just fine a moment earlier. The whole thing was weird. There was no crash, no sudden jolt, no mechanical failure that they could tell. The sub didn't lean to one side, it didn't appear damaged, and there were no signs of chaos. If it had been an engine failure, sure, maybe, but even then it wouldn't have sunk like that. Subs are built to withstand way more, especially when they're above water. And the way it sank, it didn't look like an accident. It looked like it was diving, like someone had just pressed the button to submerge it, like the sub was just going on a routine mission. Calm, smooth, controlled. Other Navy officers picked up on it too. They said it didn't look like a vessel in distress. It looked like a normal dive. No tilting, no struggle, no chaos. Just a straight, clean descent. And Peter? He didn't try to save it. Which is strange. If you built a submarine, which is your pride and joy, you wouldn't just jump off while it sank. You'd try to save it, right? Or at the very least, you'd close the hatch to keep it from filling with water. That's basic submarine info. The hatch is in the tower, a thick steel plate. Close it, and you can stop water from flooding in. But Madsen, he left it wide open. This wasn't his first submarine either. It was his third. He knew better. And it was broad daylight. People saw it. There was a lighthouse nearby. Witnesses all around. And that's when the real question started forming. Where was Kim Wall? By the time the sub sank, Kim hadn't come out. When Madsen was questioned, he told them he dropped her off around 10:30 p.m. the night before, near a harbor close to where she lived. He even named the specific harbor. As for how he knew her, he said, "Oh, I didn't really. She was a journalist from Wired doing a piece on me. It's not like I do background checks when someone asks for an interview." He clearly wanted to go home, but the police had other plans. Nothing about his story added up. If he'd dropped her off, why wasn't she home? And how convenient that they both go missing together, but only he reappears. While the cops are escorting Madsen to the car to arrest him, reporters are swarming around, shouting questions at him. They're chasing after him, yelling, "What happened? What happened?" And Madsen, he just says, "I'm fine. I'm a little sad, and seeing the Nautilus go down was extreme." He tells reporters the sub sank because of a valve failure, a ballast failure. His biographer, Thomas, who had worked very closely with him, saw the footage and immediately felt something was off. He said even when Peter faced failure in the past, he was always poetic about it. It was always about the image. If the Nautilus had truly failed, Peter would have framed it in a grand, almost romantic way, something like, "She was my greatest masterpiece, and now she sleeps beneath the waves." That's the price of chasing greatness. Sometimes it sinks before it soars. But this time, he just threw out a dry, mechanical explanation and looked like he wanted to say as little as possible. His whole demeanor was different. And this is a guy who's no stranger to failure. He's worked on rockets, submarines. Failure is part of the process. But every time before, he was eloquent, dramatic, even inspiring. But not this time. Then someone asks him about Kim, and Peter just says, "There was no one else on board, just me. No emotion, no elaboration." He gets taken to the police station for questioning. Now here's the weird part. When talking about the sub sinking, Madsen launches into these long, complicated, technical explanations, full of jargon that the police don't even understand enough to challenge. But when the topic shifts to Kim, he goes silent. He gives vague, clipped responses. Investigators later said it was odd. When someone's in shock, they either remember everything or nothing. Peter remembered every tiny detail about how the sub sank, but nothing about Kim? That's inconsistent. Meanwhile, the media was reporting that Madsen had dropped Kim off earlier that night, so everyone assumed she got off the submarine safely and something must have happened to her afterward. That's how much people trusted him. They genuinely believed he was incapable of doing anything sinister. But even that narrative didn't make much sense. Denmark is one of the safest countries in the world. Copenhagen especially is known for its safety. The odds of Kim being abducted or killed in Copenhagen are incredibly low. And what are the chances that she goes missing and then his submarine just happens to sink hours later? The timing was too convenient. When Kim's friends and fellow journalists heard the news, they were stunned, but their instincts kicked in. Something didn't sit right. The story didn't have enough details. The facts weren't adding up. They said, "What do you mean she's missing? She's been to North Korea. She's traveled to dangerous places and never gone missing." Interviewing a quirky inventor in Denmark shouldn't be risky. The police followed Madsen's lead and went to the harbor where he claimed to have dropped Kim off. They were trying to find any trace of her. Maybe she met someone. Maybe someone picked her up. Luckily, there was a bar nearby with a wide CCTV view of the harbor. They went through the footage frame by frame. Nothing. Not a single person resembling Kim was seen in that footage. No witnesses came forward either, which was huge considering she was now plastered all over the news. You'd think someone would have seen her. That changed everything. The focus of the search shifted from land to water. Authorities began to wonder, what if Kim was still in the sub? What if there was an air pocket and she was trapped inside, still alive? The Navy sent divers down. Most of the sub was already flooded, thanks to Madsen deliberately leaving the hatch open. The divers peered through the windows, no signs of life. But it wasn't safe for them to go inside either. Now, here's the timeline, just to make it clear. August 10th, evening. Around 7:30 p.m., Kim and Madsen board the Nautilus. August 11th, early morning. The sub goes missing. 8 hours later, it's spotted and then sinks. Madsen is rescued, but no sign of Kim. August 12th. He's arrested and brought to court for a preliminary hearing. No formal charges yet, but his story already has major holes. August 13th. Authorities begin the massive operation to lift the submarine out of the water. They use a giant Navy cargo ship with cranes to try and hoist it up without breaking it in half. Once it's at the harbor, they plan to drain the 9,000 gallons of water inside and begin a thorough search. That was the first real confirmation that their suspicions had weight. Kim wasn't in the submarine. But the whole situation was chaotic. Investigators reported finding what looked like pieces of flesh inside the sub. Some water hadn't fully drained either, and it had risen high enough to soak into their blue suits. One of the naval commanders touched it, and when he got out, he had this strange gut feeling. So he sniffed his suit. The smell was unmistakable, strongly of blood. Now yes, blood does have a metallic scent, and this is a steel submarine. But the commander insisted that this was different. Blood that's been diluted in water, he said, has a very distinct specific smell, and those who've been around it, like he has, know it immediately. They also found Kim's jacket still inside the submarine, which didn't make sense at all. If she'd really been dropped off at any harbor, she would have taken it with her. There was no CCTV footage of her getting off anywhere, and this wasn't some careless mistake. Kim wasn't the type to leave her things behind, especially not with important items like train tickets still tucked in the pockets. Why would she leave that? Still, despite all this, they were no closer to finding Kim. The world was now watching this case unfold in real time. Everyone was wondering, was this going to turn into a rescue mission? Or were they about to witness a recovery? Kim's parents eventually released a statement. They were devastated. They said, "Kim has worked in many dangerous places during her career as a journalist, and we've worried about her before." But the thought that something could happen to her in Copenhagen, so close to home, was unimaginable. Over 10 days later, the world's worst fears were confirmed. Police activity near the shoreline suddenly ramped up, unusual for Copenhagen. Journalists, civilians, everyone held their breath as they waited for a press conference. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but they all thought the same thing. They'd found her. And they had. But it was far worse than anyone imagined. They found a torso. Just a torso. No head, no arms, no legs. It was clear this wasn't the work of ocean life. This was dismemberment, human-inflicted. Authorities stated they still needed to confirm the identity through DNA testing, but honestly, in a city like Copenhagen, how likely was it to be someone else? The results came back. It was Kim Wall. And just like that, everything changed, including Peter Madsen's story. He suddenly came forward with a new version of events. "Okay, I didn't drop her off," he admitted. "I panicked. I didn't know how to say it." According to him, as they were trying to leave the submarine, he opened the hatch, a massive, heavy steel lid meant to keep water out. As he lifted it, he claimed he lost his grip. It slammed down on Kim's head while she was trying to leave, knocking her out cold. She collapsed. She was dead. That's what he said. Just like that. He said he was terrified, panicked, didn't know what to do. So he gave her a burial at sea. Basically, he threw her body overboard. What he failed to mention was the dismemberment. The fact that her torso showed signs of torture, that there were stab wounds in her private areas. Authorities didn't believe him for a second. And it was chilling to realize this man could look them straight in the eye and lie like that. They were now more determined than ever to prove what really happened. But to do that, they needed to understand how Kim died. Without that, convicting him of murder would be tough in court. The key? Her head. If they could find it, they could prove whether or not she suffered a head injury, like Madsen claimed. If there were no signs of blunt force trauma, his entire story would fall apart. But finding body parts in Kogi Bay? Nearly impossible. Imagine being dropped into a massive corn maze at night and told there's a single marble hidden somewhere inside. That's what the search felt like. And just to make it harder, the maze keeps shifting every few hours because of the water currents. To have even the slightest shot at finding anything, they brought in an oceanographer, someone who spent his entire life studying how objects move through water. He started building detailed search maps, calculating where something could drift based on the time, location, and current patterns. It was a mind-bending puzzle with constantly moving pieces. And on top of that, visibility underwater was terrible. On land, in a big room, you can see 20 feet ahead, maybe more. Underwater, in these murky conditions, you could barely see as far as a book's length. You couldn't just dive in and scan an area with your eyes. It was slow, grueling, and mostly guesswork. But on October 6th, 56 days after Kim disappeared, with 50 divers working daily, 30,500 dive sessions, and over 200 acres searched, they found them. Her legs and her severed head. And just as investigators suspected, her skull had no fractures, no signs of blunt force trauma. Peter Madsen was lying, again. Peter's second version of events? Total lie. The stab wounds alone told prosecutors all they needed to know. They believed he lured Kim into the submarine, sealed her inside, cut her off from the world, and essentially buried her alive with her own killer. Then he brutally tortured her, murdered her, and dismembered her. All because she was a woman doing her job. And before anyone tries to play devil's advocate with, well, it could have been a man too, let's be clear, it couldn't. Peter didn't invite any men into the sub alone that week, but he did invite several women. It honestly looked like he was just waiting for the first woman willing to go alone with him so he could kill her. He asked multiple women, friends and acquaintances, if they wanted to check out the sub. One woman was interested and said, "Cool, can I bring my kids?" Peter told her no. She thought that was odd, because Peter loved company. He was always about crowds, showing off the sub, entertaining groups. So for him to refuse, that was a red flag. She ended up declining, thankfully. After his arrest, Peter's wife quietly filed for divorce and has never spoken publicly about the case. Maybe she already knew parts of who he really was. Maybe she didn't. But either way, she cut ties and stayed silent. Now, when police got a hold of Peter's phone and computer, which, by the way, he really didn't want to hand over, he kept yelling that there were business secrets and they were trying to steal from him. Forensic experts recovered disturbing evidence. On the day he took him into the sub, Peter had been Googling things like girl beheading agony. It wasn't a random act. It was calculated. He knew what he was doing. He planned it. And his computer? Full of violent, illegal videos, basically snuff films, actual footage of women being beheaded, burned alive, tortured. These weren't horror movies where the gore is CGI. These were real. And he was watching them just hours before taking Kim into that sub. Maybe it was for gratification. Maybe to mentally prepare. Probably both. Either way, it was horrifying. He tried to claim that his interns had used his computer and watched those videos. Like, really? He wanted to drag down young people who gave their time to support his projects? Thankfully, no one bought it. One intern even testified that the day before the murder, Peter casually told him, "Hey, want to see something cool?" I found this site with unreleased crime scene photos of murder victims. The intern was creeped out, but never imagined Peter was capable of something this extreme. Authorities believe the torture Kim endured happened right around the time of her death, either just before or just after. They think tools like sharpened screwdrivers, pipes, ties, and a wood saw were used. Kim's body had 37 puncture wounds. Now, Peter knew he needed a new explanation for trial because Kim's head didn't show signs of blunt force trauma like he originally claimed. So he changed his story again. This time, he said she died of carbon monoxide poisoning. He claimed he was stuck trying to open the hatch, the engine was running, and while he was struggling above, carbon monoxide filled the submarine and Kim died quietly within 10 minutes. And the reason he didn't say this earlier? According to him, he didn't want her family to suffer knowing it took her 10 minutes to die. So he made up a quicker death story to spare them the pain. Which doesn't even make sense. If anything, blunt force trauma is more violent and traumatic to hear. Prosecutors called him out directly, then why did you cut her up? His answer? I had a big problem. What do you do with a big problem? You cut it into small pieces. Then, completely unfazed, he asked why the dismemberment mattered because, as he put it, she was already dead. That level of detachment wasn't just disturbing, it was textbook psychopathy. No empathy, no remorse, no connection to the gravity of what he'd done. Just cold, calculated logic from a man who viewed another human life as nothing more than a disposable inconvenience. As all of this came out in court, Peter kept clinging to his carbon monoxide story. But his mask was slipping. People close to him, including his biographer, said that Peter always overestimated himself. He thought he could charm and lie his way through anything. He did it with submarines, rockets, and now he thought he could do it with murder. He even tried to appeal to the jury emotionally by talking nonstop about his cats. How much he loved them, how they needed him. Like, what do your cats have to do with anything? It felt like he truly believed his needs, his pets, his life mattered more than the one he stole. Then came the psychiatric evaluation. Severe lack of empathy, no remorse, no guilt, loved watching violent videos, narcissistic, personally deviant. All of it was read in court. Several women testified too. They said Peter never showed signs of being violent or aggressive. Many of them had met him at BDSM parties, which the media tried to sensationalize, but these were consensual adult events. None of the women defended Peter. They were shocked. They described him as someone who always respected boundaries. A little weird, sure, but nothing more. They weren't defending him. They were trying to show how well he hid who he really was. The scariest part? Almost any woman he knew would have gotten into that sub with him that day. That's how normal he seemed. On April 25, 2018, just 11 days after the trial began, the court reached a verdict. Peter Madsen was sentenced to life in prison. Now, in Denmark, a life sentence doesn't necessarily mean life behind bars. You can actually apply for a pardon after serving 12 years, and on average, life sentences end up being around 16 years. Wild, right? So, it's hard to say whether he'll ever get out, but technically, there's a chance. What's even more disturbing, though, is what happened after his sentencing. Out of nowhere, Peter decided to change his story again. This time, he finally admitted to killing Kim, but still didn't say how. No details, no explanation. Just more rambling, self-centered monologues. He gave multiple phone interviews from prison, and I'm going to share some of the quotes because they're genuinely chilling. He said, "I didn't go around living a wonderful life, and suddenly, bang, I got evil. Something made it happen. This is my confession." Then he goes, "How can it be a mystery to you guys that good comes in a package with bad? There aren't heroes and bad guys, just humans. And under the right kind of pressure, under the right mistreatment, people can do horrific things to each other." Even now, after murdering someone, he's trying to position himself as some deep, poetic philosopher of human nature. And then he went on about how he was frustrated with his rocket projects failing. He claimed he didn't feel like the center of attention anymore, and it started to mess with him. Remember how he co-founded Copenhagen Suborbitals? Apparently, his partner told him, "Hey, you can still help build rockets, but we don't want you at the launches anymore." I don't know if that actually happened, but there was definitely some drama, and Peter was eventually kicked out. So what did he do? He opened his own rocket company, literally right next door to his old one, just so he could stare at it every day like some weird, petty vendetta. But things weren't going well with his new company either. See, when Peter started Copenhagen Suborbitals, he thought he'd be the star of the show. But building a rocket takes a whole team of very smart people, and smart people don't just say yes, boss to bad ideas. When Peter suggested something ridiculous, people would call him out, and he hated that. He could not handle being wrong. He couldn't work with others. He needed to be the only voice in the room, and if he wasn't, he'd get aggressive. His biographer even said, Peter lives in a world where there are only winners and losers. And at this point, Peter was losing, and losing big. Just 2 weeks before Kim's murder, one of his rocket launches had to be canceled. Things were falling apart. And that's when it became clear Peter's passion was never about submarines or rockets. His project was himself. It was always about Peter being admired, being in control, being someone. And even after all of this, Peter never talked about the crime in terms of regret. He only talked about how he felt, how stressed and miserable he was. He said stuff like, if someone calls you a narcissistic psychopath, the only way to make the verdict accurate is to become one. I know you want your monster. I can feel your hatred. But it doesn't make a difference. There's no closure here. And then, this part is wild, on October 20th, 2020, after spending 30 months in prison, Peter escaped. He built a weapon while in jail, threatened a guard, and managed to get out. He made a run for it, but the whole thing ended pretty quickly. He was caught sitting in a patch of grass, surrounded by Danish sharpshooters. That's it. That was the big escape. And of course, the question that still haunts people is, has he done this before? One of the officers on the case, this is his personal opinion, not the official police stance, said it's extremely rare for someone to commit such a violent, gruesome murder as their first offense. He believes it's likely that Peter committed sexual or violent crimes before this, maybe ones that just weren't caught. They've looked into connections between him and other unsolved disappearances, but so far, nothing solid has turned up. Still, people wonder, was Peter Madsen a serial killer? He definitely fits the profile. In the Netflix documentary, there's a scene from before the murder where he was trying to make his own movie. He got mad on set and said things like, I'd like to kill someone with a spoon. I'd choose the person randomly. And then he told the videographer, I'm going to hack you to death. When she gasped and asked, like with an axe, he quickly corrected himself. No, I said hug. You heard hack. It was really eerie. This case has devastated so many people around the world. We lost an incredibly talented journalist whose entire goal was to help others and tell important stories. Most female journalists said they wouldn't have thought twice about getting on that submarine. He wasn't a war criminal. He was just a guy who built a submarine. She was doing her job, and she ran into a killer. Peter Madsen isn't some dark, complex villain. He is just a pathetic narcissist, desperate to be the main character. He wanted to be feared, worshipped, seen as larger than life. But in the end, he was just a coward who created destruction for attention. And now, he's just another convicted murderer sitting in a cell. He'll eventually be forgotten. But Kim Wall, she'll be remembered forever. Her family and friends started the Kim Wall Memorial Fund, which supports female journalists around the world. Her mom said it best, the world needs more courageous women like Kim, women who give a voice to the voiceless and make this planet a better place. And that brings us to the end of today's case. If you have any information or thoughtful insights about this case, please let us know respectfully in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on future cases. And until next time, when we explore another bone-chilling case right here on Slice of Darkness. Stay vigilant, stay safe,